we are holding this in the run-up to the Urban Living Festival, which is being organized by the International Hospitality Media Group. It's being held on the 25th and 26th of November. There are still opportunities this year. Hopefully, I believe the idea is to have it in person event, which will want to be possibly one of the first in-person events this year, and one of the few. There are still some exhibitor stands, delegate tickets, and sponsorship opportunities available. Just as I just mentioned, some webinar guidelines. Again, if you don't mute yourselves, we will go through and mute you. It won't be me, and I apologize. It's just for the sake of keeping this efficient and clean. We have got about 45-minute discussion with our panel. I'm going to introduce the topic a little bit first, and then let the panel introduce themselves. We have a couple of co-hosts, Joe and Justin, who are on hand to answer any questions if you have any. There is a chat feature, and you can put some questions in there. They will collect the questions and feed them to me, and we'll try and have about 15 minutes towards the end of the session to answer some of your questions, which I know you're going to have plenty of. We've got a good group of panelists. First of all, let me introduce myself as my little, that's me there, a few years ago. I've got about 25 years of experience running feasibility studies, operator searches, asset management projects, just hospitality consulting for the industry. I work for PKF Hotel Experts, running the London office here. We've got 12 offices worldwide, and we do this all over the world for hotels, Aparthotels, service departments, and conference centers and various other forms of hospitality. That's probably enough about me. I'm very passionate about the topic, which is why we're here today. We've got a great group of panelists. They're each going to get a few minutes to introduce themselves a little bit later on. But just quickly, we've got a couple of operators, brands. We've got an important investor, and an expert in the PRS and build to rent sector as well. Which I'm very pleased about, because my expertise does not necessarily cover those things. So it's good to have a variety of different people in the room. Just to put a little bit of context. Obviously, joking aside about the temperature today in the UK, and if probably in many other places around Europe where you may be dialing in from, global warming and climate change is a real problem, and the real estate and hospitality industries have to act to help solve that problem, as we all do. But just to put a bit of context and give a few statistics, was a hotel decarbonization report in 2017 by the International Tourism Partnership, which stated that the hotel industry would need to reduce its GHG greenhouse gas emissions by 66% per room per year by 2030 and 90% by 2050 in order to adhere to the global goals of limiting climate change by, I think it's 1.5 or 2 degrees. That's a lot. The airline and hospitality industries combined, so the tourism industry, are responsible for approximately 8% of global greenhouse emissions, and approximately 12% of the total European waste. We consume in the UK alone about £400 million worth of energy in the UK, perhaps not quite so much this year, as a lot of hotels are closed, but still a big number. And buildings as a whole account for an estimated 36% of Europeans' greenhouse gas emissions, and 40% of the EU's energy consumption. So we are relatively high emitters in the industries that we work in. And there is a big movement from stakeholders to reduce the global greenhouse emissions, to reduce plastic usage and overall waste. And governments are leading initiatives to enforce these things, and investors increasingly getting on to the back of this, as well as guests and clients or tenants. The stakeholders in the conversation, obviously all of us, we've all got our to make an effort to make this happen globally. The developers, investors, lenders, operators, and all the supply chain staff, guests and tenants are all involved in making these changes and influencing our companies. ESG credentials, we'll discuss this as we go through, but they're moving from a nice to have for a company to a must have, as the investment community becomes more and more interested in these types of investments, and the activists are actively green shaming people who are greenwashing. If you do something wrong, if you fall foul of ESG standards, or make mistakes, it will become very high profile very quickly with current modern media technology. And the old argument that implementing sustainable practices in green buildings costs more and might erode eventual yields is no longer holds true. Guests will pay more to stay in healthy and sustainable hotels. There's some evidence to say that. They may pay more to stay in green and healthy apartments. And there are other benefits across the P&L, as well as governments around the world are taking aim at polluting industries and are going to create penalties for not abiding by various laws, rules. And then there are private equity investors and institutional investors that are jumping into the space. I think there's a nice quote, in fact, that James put me onto from the Sunday Times last week from Oliver Shah, mentioning that there were more than 360 ESG funds launched in Europe alone last year. And while the bit at the beginning, institutional investors tend to behave like sheep, and the sheepdogs that have chased them around in recent years have worn ESG tags on their collars. So I see Leslie smiling about that one. It's true. So as the investment community gets more involved and interested in it, I think the topic will become more important to everybody as well, and the solutions will probably come out of that. Just a last little bit, a little quote from Larry Fink before we ask our guests to introduce themselves. Larry Fink of BlackRock, in a letter to CEOs beginning of the year, mentioned that climate risk is investment risk. And another little quote from him is, ultimately, purpose is the engine of long-term profitability. With companies like BlackRock getting fully behind this type of thing, it's not very long until everybody will. So on that, and perhaps I'd like to ask my esteemed panelists to introduce themselves briefly, and then we can get into answering some of these important questions. So I will start with Leslie as the main investor in this panel to take us forward.
Sure. Well, so first of all, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Leslie Gent. I head up the Responsible Investing Initiative at Coutts. Coutts is a wealth manager, and basically our client base is individuals like you and I, basically looking to invest their wealth for the longer term. It could be planning for the next generation, or it could be for shorter term objectives. But as head of responsible investing, I'm very focused on the integration of these risks that have just been discussed: environmental, social, and governance. And we've embedded it in our investment process. So that basically means everything we invest in, we think about these risks and opportunities that are associated with what are traditionally termed non-financial elements, but more and more we're seeing very strong evidence that environmental, social, and governance issues do actually drive long-term returns. So for us, in a sense, like Larry Fink's comment, this is very much for us about maintaining the returns that investors expect from us. We just think we can do that in a better way by being more responsible and more sustainable. So our focus is always on what we call the triple bottom line, which is profit, of course, but also people and the planet. And that's really the ethos of how we invest.
Thank you, Leslie. Perhaps Richard could follow on from there.
Yeah, hello everybody. It's good to see, well, at least some of you at least. I've been involved in the residential sector probably for about 40 years. And for 20 of those in residential investment, 10 of which in build to rent. I'm author of Understanding Build to Rent, the changing face of the private rented sector, which is a document aimed at local authorities, particularly, and more specifically committees. I'm also sort of a member of the steering group and advisor to the annual Build to Rent Forum, speaker on various sort of build to rent conferences and seminars, including the UKAA, IRPM, and leasehold. I'm currently a consultant advisor, strategic advisor to Housey, which is a PropTech operational management platform. I'm an advisor to GoVelo, which is an innovative cycle security platform. I'm a business development advisor to BKA Floor Plans, and I sort of specialize in advising companies about what their place is within the build to rent environment. And more recently, since ESG has become a more important aspect of investment, within my purview of being a holistic sort of build to rent expert, it's something that we look at throughout every aspect of build to rent, whether it's investment itself, whether it's development, whether it's viability or operational management. And so ESG has become probably one of the most important things that we discuss, whoever we talk about, or whatever we talk about within the sector.
Thank you, Richard. Well, you're the go-to for build to rent on this panel, especially. But let me ask James to introduce himself.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I'm was the co-founder of a brand called Base Aparthotels, which was in Switzerland. When we came up with the idea for Base, it had 3 pillars of design, technology, and sustainability. If I'm honest, at the time, this was about 8-10 years ago, I thought that was because everyone would be doing sustainability and hospitality over the next few years. And as a bit of an outsider to the industry, I thought that would just be the norm, and have been shocked by the lack of movement in the industry over the last 5 to 10 years. I have now actually exited from Base at the end of last year, and have set up a new brand in the UK called Beyond Aparthotels. The aim of Beyond is to roll out a brand that is truly sustainable. It doesn't just pay lip service, whether it be how it's built, but particularly how it's operated. And one of my big things is I think sustainability has been slightly miscommunicated, or it's difficult to communicate, difficult to get your head around the bigger picture. I think you have to answer the question of the guest of what's in it for me. And if I was to go out onto the street and say to someone, do you want to stay in a carbon-free, zero use of one-time plastic hotel? I think most people go, no, but what's in it for me? But if you go out on the street and say, would you like to stay in a room where the air is 95% cleaner than the air on the street, where we don't use any chemicals to clean the room, where it's a low dust environment, or there's no non-use of VOCs, and you're going to wake up feeling more refreshed, you're going to sleep better and perform better the next day. I think that it would appeal to a number of people. I think like any brand, any good brand, in my eyes, it's not about appealing to the majority, it's about appealing to the small minority, but appealing in a very large way. And if you get that right, if they truly believe what you're doing, then others will ultimately follow. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Great. Well, from appealing to a minority, perhaps Josh's company, and Josh can introduce himself, but their hotels perhaps are trying to appeal to a larger majority of people. But here, Josh, maybe you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Adam, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Josh Littman. I oversee European development for SH Hotels and Resorts. We are an affiliate of Starwood Capital, and we're essentially founded and still overseen by Barry Sternlicht. We have 3 core brands and a collection brand. We have the Baccarat Hotels and Resorts, which is ultra luxury. We have One Hotels, which is our nature-driven platform, which is our flagship flag. And then we have Treehouse, which is a sort of little sister, upper upscale version to One Hotels. And then we have a collection brand. You know, with us, and I'll speak mainly about One Hotels, given the focus of the webinar. But you know, it was created as a platform for change. And you know, if you look at some of the historic podcasts that Barry Sternlicht's given, and you know, he really wanted to create this mission-driven platform. And rather than have a hotel company trying to bolt on sustainability, we really wanted to have our mission be the primary focus and have the brand evolve off of that. And that's all centered around sustainability. But more importantly, it's to not, you know, at least with that particular brand, is not having to give up on luxury. And so a lot of consumers feel that they're having to, you know, stay in an environmentally or socially, you know, sustainable hotel, that they're going to give up on something in some way, or limited showers, or, you know, some sort of, you know, hemp sheets or something that are, you know, not as comfortable as frette linen or whatever. So that, you know, a lot of those are misnomers. And you know, the important point is, I think that we're sort of testament to the success of being probably one of the only mission-driven brands out there that consumers are paying a premium for. We have, you know, a number of hotels who are, you know, we're seeing RFPs for groups that are specifically asking for sustainability and green credentials. We're seeing that with increasing frequency. We have a lot of groups and consumers and high-end travel agencies that are booking with us specifically because of our approach to sustainability. And consumers are willing to pay a premium. And that's, you know, we've seen the data. We know how we perform against the competition. And, you know, there's definitely a large and growing segment of the market who is willing to pay more to have, you know, to be part of this movement, to sort of leave the world, if not, you know, as you know, the way you found it, better off. And so, you know, I think as a new company, we're able to build these best practices at the early stage, which may not be as feasible as some of the larger groups out there. But right now we'll ride that wave while we can, and hope that other people will sort of, you know, work along the same lines and same direction we are in promoting, you know, ESG sustain.
Great, and I guess that's a good segue into sort of who owns your hotels, Josh? I mean, how does sustainability benefit hospitality owners? That was one of the lead up questions, and perhaps you and James maybe can take that on from a hospitality perspective, and then Richard can answer that question from a PRS and build to rent perspective, and Leslie can take notes from an owner's perspective.
Yeah, so we actually have quite a range of different owners. We have private equity groups, we have, you know, high net worths, we have regional sort of family offices, we have sort of blue chip institutional groups. So it's quite a range. You know, I think, as I mentioned earlier, you know, we've been able to, you know, identify and track the data that shows that consumers are willing to pay a premium. So there's an upside in income. It's still as yet kind of a niche segment in some regards, and that the mainstream mass market is not doing it to the same degree yet, although it seems like that's changing. There was a comment you made earlier on your intro slides, Adam, about the, you know, the misconception that building sustainable hotels or running sustainable hotels costs more. And the reality is, in most cases, it doesn't. There may be some, initial costs that are above and beyond what a normal hotel would have, but then there are savings that are generated, in sort of, overheads down the road, even in the short term. And then, more importantly, there are a lot of costs. It's not necessarily how much money you spend, but how you spend it. So, doing away with single-use plastics, trying to use, second life materials, reusable materials. We have a, reception desk in our West Hollywood hotel that was made from a felled tree in the forest of Northern California. So you're still spending money on a reception desk, but it's more meaningful and it ties in, and you're backing up, you're sort of walking the walk. And, so there are cost savings and, short term and long term. And I think, especially when you get into the building design principles, our aim is to have, a zero carbon footprint going down the road in the future, and sort of having, hotels be LEED certified, and, we're working towards that. But a lot of that is there's going to be cost savings generated, and there's going to be revenue premiums that are generated on the back of this whole package of sustainability.
Thank you. And James, did you find that? I mean, you've opened your own 2 hotels previously. I think it was 2 Aparthotels in Switzerland. Did you find that was true?
Yes, I mean, I think I had a supportive investor who believed in the concept, which I think is really important. I think, certainly the conversations I'm having now with investors, it's not about the old model, I think, of you own the real estate and I'll operate the site for you. And I think forward-looking investors are now saying, no, we want to be part of both. We see the benefit of that. And I think there was a bit of them and us. The operator was saying, well, will you spend a bit more money? It doesn't need to be a lot, like Josh was saying, a little bit more money up front for long-term gains. And they were saying, well, hang on, that's your gain, that's not our gain. So I think there has to be that partnership of owner and operator together, and then everyone benefits. I think, ultimately, I believe, you have to be talking and implementing sustainable measures today, because that will make your building future-proof. I can only see the current situation accelerating the movement towards more sustainable based brands and ESG. If you don't do it today, I think you're going to be playing catch up, and it's going to be a lot more expensive in 2, 3 or 4 years time, whether it's your guests are dictating that to you, whether it's your stakeholders, or whether it's regulation, dictating it to you. I think also it's interesting your point about, the amount of funds that are have launched in 2019, the 360 funds. I think there's going to be a lot of capital chasing very few genuine opportunities. I think it's easy to tick one of the ESG boxes, but not necessarily all of them. And so I think, if you do it right, I think investors are going to reap the benefit of better exit values.
Make one more point on the back of that, James. I forgot to mention this in my previous answer, but we are also noticing that our hotels are starting to change hands amongst owners, and they're changing hands from major institutional private equity players to others. Our hotel in South Beach sold at a record price per key at the time, and that changed between 2 major global players, and that just that's testament to the fact that it's it's not a niche investment product, and that the big guys are seeing, real financial value in investing in this sector.
Yeah, I'd say,
just to move along a bit, Richard, are you finding the same sort of debates happening in build to rent?
Yeah, we're having the same sort of debates, and it's amongst the same sort of investor types as Josh has in his sector. And it's the difference between the commercial sectors, and I would include the hotel sector in that, and the residential sector, is that, this is going to upset some of the residential guys, but the commercial sector has always been a lot more thoughtful and a lot more professional in many ways, and it's always been thinking about the future. On top of which, its data has always been much more transparent as well. So it's also always a lot easier to do things in the commercial sector when you've got a lot of people, a lot of moving pieces, but they're all sort of meshing together. In the residential sector, we have a lot of moving pieces, but they don't or haven't in the past tended to touch each other. But with build to rent, we've now got this confluence between residential and commercial where the now investors demand that sort of transparency and they demand that sort of cooperation for data. So we're getting closer to how the commercial sector works, which is really quite a sort of a good thing. On the ESG thing, you mentioned a little bit about the ticking all the boxes, and you know, this conversation is very much about the E of ESG, but they do all work together. And you know, in my mind, there is no ES without G. You know, it starts with governance. It's got to be driven by governance, because if it isn't, and as you can see by Larry Fink's letter to CEOs, you know, BlackRock is the largest asset management company in the world. It's got like 7.2 trillion under management. It's absolutely massive. And if that guy is saying you have to invest, you know, in ESGS, sustainable assets, then everybody has to take it seriously. And that doesn't matter what sector you're in. You know, everybody's got to take it seriously. The great thing about build to rent is that it's driven by a different mindset to residential in the past. And so environmental, social and governance is high on the list, really high on the list. And they're looking, because these assets are going to be held for 40 years plus by institutions, you know, similar to those that sort of Josh was talking about. I mean, we've got sort of LNG and M&G in there, Aberdeen Standard, Hermes, or even British Land, you know, so, and Granger, you know, who've been a property owner for years and years and years. These guys, you know, are not looking to flip these assets or to sort of sweat them in any sort of way. They're looking to hold them for a long time because it's it's an asset which gives you a predictable income over a period of time. So, you know, it is crucial that in the future, as James was saying, that they are future-proofed. Because well, these guys are going to own these assets in 40 years' time, and if they're not future-proofed, A, they're going to be classed as a second-class asset and valued as such. So that's not going to leave them anywhere. And secondly, you know, they're not going to be able to fulfill their credentials, you know, on a global platform. So, as far as being build to rent concerns, ESG is one of the most crucial elements of what we do.
And the guest cares as much as the hotel guest, or are they more concerned about the cost of?
Well, I mean, I'd like to think so, and frankly, I mean, we do talk about you know, a green premium for things, but you know, in the world of rental, individuals are renting stuff. You know, it's really about how much money you've got in your pocket at the end of the month, and we have a range of build to rent which is coming through. Very early on, it was premium, and there was a reason for that, and that was because it was competing very heavily with buy to sell. And so we had to create a premium asset in order to be able to compete and start, you know, rolling out some of the first assets. And I guess you could say that Moda was one of those, and they produce a really fantastic, amenity-rich asset. And if you just talk about Moda for 1 minute, they've just partnered with a business called Utopia, and Utopia is an IoT-powered business, which you know, places sensors throughout the building, and that basically makes the building operate more efficiently. It looks at humidity and temperature and CO2 and light and noise and all those sort of things in order to create a better place to live, you know, well-being for the people. So at an upper level, you know, they are, you know, some of the people who can afford to consider whether or not, it's a choice really, whether or not they want to be in a carbon zero, you know, holistically well-being place. Yeah, they can do, but we're now seeing other people coming through, other assets coming through which are more mid-market. I would doubt to an extent whether or not they're quite so concerned. But you know, life is very much like sort of, if you give people the option, they'll take the option. But if you don't, but if you're charging a super premium on it for green investments, then you know, I suspect that they probably might compromise in some way or another with what they're prepared to accept. And I think that feeds through to what I believe in terms of green premium in terms of asset value. I think we will see ESG compliant assets continue to maintain their value. and to maintain their yield profiles going forward as we go through the years. But it's those buildings that don't that will drop in value, and the yields will begin to soften up there.
Excellent. And I think that's a perfect segue to a question I have for Leslie, who I think is responsible for making sure that their investments are ESG compliant, or at least to a certain. And just the question is, what does that mean? What are you looking at when you're trying to make sure that these things are compliant? Yeah,
good question. And actually, it each one of you have said something that I've kind of said yes. So for us, the transparency is so important, right? That data, it's important because someone mentioned regulation. For asset managers, asset owners, regulation is coming, and we will be required to produce MI around environmental and social metrics. And we can only do that if the companies we're investing in, the properties we invest in, are producing that for us. So we're absolutely looking for companies that, in a sense, have that strategy in place, have that vision, and have really set clear targets. Because it's only once you've set targets that you can start measuring progress. And I also think there's a difference between investing in, something that's green today versus the reality that most of the built environment is not green. And so for us as an investor, we're also looking at that conversion, right? So how do the buildings move from sort of being very inefficient to being efficient? And what's it going to cost to get us there? These are very long-term investments. So these risks that are sort of 10, 30, 50 years out matter for property. So all of that, there has to be a strategy in place. The owners of those businesses need to understand these risks, and they need to have a plan in place to mitigate it. I should sort of do a caveat here. We invest through other asset managers. So someone, I think Richard, you mentioned LNG. That's a fund that we invest in, and they're phenomenal. They've got a phenomenal sort of sustainability approach and very thorough. But the sort of backbone of it is the sort of transparency. They're very clear about what they're looking at in their properties under the E, the S, and the G, and they report on progress. They set the targets and they report, and they're transparent about it. So for us as an investor, that really matters. And if I can just say one other thing, because there's a lot of talk about premium and sort of, I suppose I agree with Richard, it's more about the risk of not staying in business. I think that's the biggest price here that everyone needs to pay attention to. But certainly the one thing that we're very focused on is what's commonly referred to as a just transition. So yes, we have to look at climate change, and we need to put measures in place to ensure that businesses are putting in strategies to ensure that they're sort of net zero, for example. But also it's how they do that, because there's going to be a huge spectrum of individuals that are disproportionately impacted, negatively impacted. And so this really needs to be a just transition. We need to think about everyone along that sort of socioeconomic spectrum.
And do the fund investors that you're speaking to, I mean, how deep is their sort of caring about sustainability, or is it just a box checking exercise?
It's a good question. So without a doubt, and you've made all these quotes about the growth of this market. So I always talk about the tipping point. Really, I think during the COVID crisis, that has tipped ESG, I think, into sort of mandatory for every asset manager. I think it's tipped it into, I'm very curious if I'm an investor, right? I want to ask some questions. I may not know the right questions to ask, but I'm curious enough. So the demand, I think, is increasing significantly. And, back to sort of greenwashing or actually, I'm okay with box ticking, because you have to start with ticking boxes. You have to have a framework and you have to decide what you're going to do. But the greenwashing is all about, showing what you're doing. And that is so important. And it's not easy to show, by the way, as an investor. I mean, some of the challenges that we have are really in demonstrating that we are sustainable and that we consider these issues. And again, that comes back to data. But our investors want to know the impact that their wealth has on the economy, I suppose, and on society.
Adam, I'd just like to say, you know, I've been in the sort of forefront of talking to investors, I suppose, for at least 12 months now. And I'd say even 12 months ago, I'd walk into the room and they'd say, right, tell us about your business model, tell us about your strategy. And maybe at the end, we might touch on sustainability, and then it would reverse back round to the business model. I'd say now I walk in the room and the right kind of investor goes, right, before we start with anything else, let's talk about what you're doing sustainability-wise and how far you are going. So I think that there has been, like Leslie saying, a seismic change. That doesn't mean it's across the board. It doesn't mean it's with everyone. But if with the right kind of investor, I think there's going to be a real opportunity to create really interesting, low-impact brands.
I think that's a really, really good point, especially with how quickly this seems to be changing and people seem to be jumping on this bandwagon. I think, you know, perhaps Larry Fink had something to do with it, but I think it was generally changing anyway. And perhaps the lockdown, I mean, it's a good transition into sort of, you know, the COVID, is it good or bad for sustainability in the long run, has given a lot of these investors a little bit of time to think about it as they're all locked down, and perhaps they're investing a little bit more time and personnel into having policies that fit and that work. You know, and I think that perhaps is across the operating platforms as well, although maybe not quite so much. But certainly I've heard stories of brands being formed and policies being written quickly and things like that during this period. Josh, what about you? I mean, you're working as part of Starwood Capital or affiliate of Starwood Capital, so clearly very, you know, Barry Sternlicht's a very savvy hotel investor and real estate investor, and he wouldn't be doing this just for purpose, potentially. There must be a money piece to it as well. Do the funds that they're, you know, how does that work?
I can't speak for Starwood Capital, but I think it's pretty clear that you know, there's clearly you know, of course there's an investment angle, right? Otherwise, you know, it's not sustainable. You know, and that's, you know, that's been, you know, he's identified a gap in the market in much in the same way that when, you know, W was created way back in the day, there was a gap in the market between what consumers were looking for and what the operators were providing. This is a bit more complicated than that because it's not just a product experience, but it's also a much deeper sustainable angle. You know, and there is, you know, from an investor standpoint, there's money that can be made. And I'll give you an interesting example, actually, in terms of cost, is that, you know, right now we're talking to another major global operator, a global private equity group, about the potential conversion of a Mediterranean resort. And it's an old, it must have been built in the 60s, you know, and it's got like zero sustainable green, you know, credentials whatsoever. So there's a big discussion about, right, well, how much is this going to cost us to do this? And so we're going through, and there's definitely some, you know, if they weren't going to do it, then yes, there's an incremental cost to it. But if they don't do it, or if they don't do most of it or some of it, then they're just kicking the can down the road. And some of my colleagues on the panel had already mentioned, you know, it's happening, right? And at some point, if you're not going to take responsibility for implementing at least some of these development principles or design principles or operational principles today, then you could very well be eroding value down the road at exit. And so, you know, the cost of investment today can indeed generate value because as we go forward, as we fast forward several years in typical private equity, you know, 3, 5, 7 year hold period, at the end of that, it's probably, safe to assume that more people, more groups will be more tuned into this sustainability discussion, and will see the value in it. And if you hadn't prepared for that, then someone else has to pay for it. And so, it's just an interesting discussion we're having literally after I get off this web panel with them. So, I think, as I said, there are, hotels are changing hands amongst the major investment groups in the world because of the fact that there is value to be generated in this space, and it's not being done at a large enough scale yet where they're identified. That's opportunistic at the moment. Maybe down the road it'd be less opportunistic and it'll be more the norm. But in the meantime, I think people are capitalizing on sort of this, where we are at the base of the curve.
So perhaps from an investment perspective, that just transition that Leslie was talking about, from the existing buildings, which obviously are not green, or contributing 40% or whatever that number was to global greenhouse emissions in Europe, and et cetera, et cetera. The opportunity is for opportunistic investors to take some of these buildings and get them ready for institutional investors to invest in 3 to 5 years when they are greenified, or at least they have ESG policies and standards in place, that they've updated the heating, the roof, the living standards, made sure the policies for running the business are on top. And I guess that's the opportunity for James and for you as well, as you look at transforming buildings from perhaps existing hotels, existing Aparthotels, into ones which do tick the boxes that Leslie's investors need ticking.
Can I just interrupt before you answer? Sorry. And I think investors are interested in being on that journey. I mean, investors love change. They love turnaround stories. And equally, from an pure investment perspective, momentum is a lovely thing to follow. And that sort of improvement momentum is an important element that a lot of investors are looking for. So it's not just once it's green, we want to be there to help you transition.
Important to see. So even the institutional investors were happy to pay now and pay for the transmission
at the right price. Absolutely.
Okay.
The right price. Yes. I think it's, it's important that the investors wouldn't be interested in the opportunity if there wasn't an upside, or if it was too cost prohibitive, then it just wouldn't make sense. It's like, well, let someone else do it on their dime. And, and I think, we're not here, to shove these green credentials down every investor's throat and saying, well, we're not going to do it unless you're 100% LEED certified. I wouldn't say exactly we take what we can get, but we're reasonable, and, we're in it for the long haul as a group, and as an operator, we don't want to sign, we'd like to be operating any hotel for 20 plus years. So, we take it on board ourselves as operators to cut into some of our potential fees to make sure that we're continuously improving the asset through the operations. So this transition phase, to a certain extent, you should, even every little bit counts, right? And so, things as small as, water management or waste management and, recycling. I mean, these are all, obviously very small, not too cost prohibitive, and they just grow from there. But you start wrapping all that up into a mindset and a mentality. And then you realize that, it's easier to transition once you're sort of partway. Once you got one toe dipped in the water, then you put your foot in, then your leg, and then you jump in. And so, yeah, I think it doesn't have to be, black or white, and this transition is, any little bit matters, really.
And on the build to rent, I mean, we were talking, was it Monday, about the industry here is pretty young. So a lot of the buildings are fairly new buildings anyway, presumably, that have been built. But how is that sort of, is there a transition there to be made? Are there some buildings that were built at in early stages that need to be upgraded, or what would you say?
Well, there were some buildings, acquired, even from as far back as 2008, during the GFC, which early investors bought in their entirety, and in some instances they had to finish them off, and in other instances they bought completed buildings. and they've owned them for a period of time. Now that isn't, strictly speaking, build to rent in the true sense of the word, in the sense that the asset itself has been designed as a rental product. But interestingly, in terms of modern, as we sort of move through times, buildings that are being delivered now are just beginning to show, signs of, sustainable assets, as part of their sort of DNA. But there is a big, opportunity for people to improve assets, like there is in any other sort of way. One of the things I talk about with operational managers is about their opportunity when they're pitching for business to incorporate part of an ESG and asset improvement over time. Because generally speaking, whenever I've looked at in the past, a pitch for business, it might be someone looking to pitch for, an operational management business of an owner of a number of sort of large scale assets. It, generally speaking, is all about efficiency, how good they are at customer service, how good they are at leasing up buildings, what their occupancy rate is, and that sort of stuff. And what they've left out in the past is how we can improve your asset over time to be compliant ESG. I think that's a really big asset, a big opportunity for asset managers to start to come through, or operational asset managers to come through and start to look at those assets and say to these guys, listen, we're going to have to spend a bit more money over time, so a little bit more capex here and there. But fundamentally, what we're looking to do is that down the line, when you choose to dispose of this asset, turn it around into another asset, we're going to make you more money out of it. And that's not because we're going to actually generate more income, because anybody can do that. We're all professionals. But what we are going to do is we're going to get a couple of ticks, off that yield. So instead of selling it off at, say, a 4.5% base, we might be selling it off a 4.25 or a 4% base. And if you've got something that's producing $7 million a year, that translates into a big difference in terms of the asset value.
Yeah. We've got 10-minute warning. We've got 10 minutes left. We've got one or two questions that are starting to come in. I just had a quick last question on that. Are there any brands, like we've got James's Beyond Aparthotels that's focused very much on that, and One Hotel obviously focused very much on ESG and on healthy sustainability. Are there any brands in your sector that are doing that have taken the bull by the horns and are running with it?
Well, there are smaller SME builders like Utopia or Zero, who are looking to develop houses as opposed to apartment blocks, which are carbon zero and sustainable going forward. So they would have some form of PVs on the roof or energy storage capacity and built sort of passive house standards. Going back to sort of the larger, sort of more urban scale stuff, just probably go back to Moda and what they're thinking about, not just in terms of E, but E, S, and G. And so it's the whole thing they're sort of looking at. So they're looking at sort of tenant well-being. They're looking at building well-being as well. So how healthy is that building going forward? And of course, Leslie has mentioned L&G, who are really quite, strong on this. They've just opened Black Horse Mills, which has been designed by a sale architecture for them. That's a really big scheme. A lot of the thinking that went into that building was around sustainability and around energy management and about future-proofing the building. And that also means sort of life cycle costs and life cycle values of materials going forwards. So stuff, so for instance, if you can make something better, which is more organic and lasts longer, then you're not throwing away materials the whole time. And each of this has a sort of knock-on effect, generally speaking, on the planet.
Good. So let me get to some of these questions. Thank you, Richard. First question from James Devitt, and it's probably more to the operators and owners, but are there any steps owners, operators can take to encourage guests to reach their asset in a more sustainable manner and perhaps stay longer to make the travel a less impactful part of the cost of stay? This would not involve capital as much as impacting the mindset of the guests. James, can you tackle that one? Or Josh, have you got any thoughts on that?
I think you can build in a train station. That's the start. I mean, it's something we focused on. Basically, all our sites were built near train stations. It's a great form of transport. I think it's difficult to dictate to people how they arrive. Obviously, you can offer some form of transport from airports, whether it be electric vehicles. I mean, certainly beyond, and at my previous company, we offered free bikes. A lot of companies say, well, we'll charge you a nominal fee. Well, that doesn't encourage people to use that as an alternative form of transport. So I think that it's giving them the education about the alternatives they can use rather than the combustion engine is important. And then if you do have to have car parking, if it's dictated to you by the planning authority, then you incentivize people maybe to use an electrical car and free parking and those kind of things. So it's how they get to you, but also very importantly, how they move around when they are with you, which is something we can really impact on.
Perhaps that's an interesting one from a risk perspective as well from the investors. And I think your point about building near train stations is a very good one, especially in some places in Europe where the fast train network is improving greatly. Does the airport hotel location suddenly lose a bit of value as the airlines are all perhaps struggling a little bit, and flight shaming increases, and people start to think about whether they should take a flight or not. So the choice of location is actually a very, very good point. And perhaps the risk of doing something at an airport, should that be discounted at a different level than perhaps the train stations? Will the sites near the train stations become more valuable as we go through this sort of journey? That's a very good point.
I think just to build on what James was saying, I think education is very key. It's about educating your guests and your employees and your suppliers and in general, and letting them know that whatever it is that you're doing in your sphere of responsibility to make the world a better place. That's pretty key. And it's also, I think in terms of, someone had mentioned it earlier on the panels, choice. And if you give someone, if you give them the choice and it's there, they will probably choose it if they have an option. But if they have to ask for it, or if they have to pay for it, if they do something, if they have to make an extra effort to do it, it makes it a bit harder to adopt. And so, some things, we have, there are carbon offsetting initiatives that guests can contribute to, some certain portion of funds that come through that, from guests' invoices can go to specific sustainability or ESG charities and that sort of thing, or even local based. And it's certain elements like that. So if you stay longer, more gets contributed. And so there are ways to say, if you stay here and you don't travel on the peak day, then you're going to have less of an impact on pollution and what's normally the busy day of the year, and there's all sorts of ways of educating your guests to try to ease them into making decision to, ideally we'd love them to stay as long as possible, right? But there's a reason, and you can provide enough of a positive reason why, at least why they're staying is having a positive impact, and they may extend.
Well, Piers Brown asked the question, having stayed in a one hotel in Brooklyn, what struck him was the very much differing guest demographic. The corporate road warriors were absent, healthy individuals and families. How does SH market the brand to their growing audience?
I think it really varies property to property, and city and city, region to region, country to country, and some market. I think that particular hotel is unique in that it's in Brooklyn. It's not in Manhattan. It's not by Midtown. Interestingly, that hotel is, I think, the second highest performing hotel, or one of the highest performing hotels in Southern Manhattan. And a lot of that is, it's a strong leisure market, but there's also a good amount of business because you can just hop over on the bridge and you're there. It outperforms by significant amounts the other Brooklyn hotels at the top, and a huge portion of the Southern Manhattan hotels, and that's because of the mix of demand. So I think maybe Piers, maybe you didn't recognize the Wall Street executive walking around in his his hemp shoes and stuff because he was off duty, but there's definitely a mix of demand. There's also a bit of self-selection to a certain extent, and it's this whole sort of mystique around this the sector, and we're able to provide this type of product and experience without giving up on luxury. And I think people, again, goes back to my point, people are willing to pay a premium for it. So it's a whole package understanding where we are in the space.
That's good. Well, I guess it's a good segue onto the last question I've got so far, unless anyone else has some more, which is how engaged are corporate travel buyers with the sustainability agenda? Do they have checkboxes, and are they asking questions of operators about their green credentials? Now, I guess I've been involved in quite a few of these panels and spoken to a number of different operators about that, and certainly heard that especially some of the newer tech companies, but many of the other bigger companies are indeed asking those questions and have checklists, and some of the big ones in Facebooks and Googles and Apple and all of those. I'm very sorry, I've got somebody trying to deliver a parcel to me. The perils of home working. But perhaps, you know, James, when you were in Switzerland with your properties there, and Josh, you could speak to that a little bit. I know you already did a little bit, Josh, earlier on in one of your answers.
Yeah, I think, again, when we started, it wasn't on the RFP list. It wasn't really important. It certainly came and is on the list. How important it is to the actual corporate buyer is debatable. Ultimately, they are incentivized by reducing the budget for the corporate for travel, and that is the foremost requirement for them to do well in their job. I think it is moving more towards, I think you're exactly right, that it is the new age companies, it is the companies that are looking more to the future, the companies that are seeing the data, the Googles of the world, they are seeing the data, come out of their searches and what people are choosing to do, that are very much moving in that direction and are prepared to put their money where their mouth is. I think the old dinosaurs, the petroleum companies, or whether the pharmaceutical companies, the bigger, they are much less likely to make a choice, in my opinion, towards something that is sustainably operated. There'll be other things that are still above the list. I think it's really important with sustainability that obviously that's not the be all and end all. It has to be a good product, has to be a great service that you have to be providing, but you can do that in a sustainable way. And very quickly, as an example of that, we don't do buffet breakfast. The buffet breakfasts, I think, are ridiculous. Huge amount of waste, huge amount of overconsumption. But you have to offer breakfast. So we offered a breakfast bag, and people could choose what they wanted. They'd be delivered to their room, and they could have that in the comfort of their own room. And obviously, we're in Aparthotels, so they have kitchens in their room. They get a better service. They pay less for what they're having. They get exactly what they want, and it reduces a huge amount of waste. So you have to provide innovative solutions like that. You can't ask the guests to do anything to be sustainable. You have to make it even better for them. But the flip side of it, it also has a sustainable angle.
Perfect. So sort of nudging the guests to do the right thing is
with a benefit to them, exactly, a cost and convenience benefit. Yeah.
Very good. Well, listen, we've had our hour, and thank you very much for a really interesting chat, and I'm sure that the viewers here are very grateful, having spent some of the warm August afternoon listening. The next webinar in this series is placemaking. Is it overvalued buzzword or underutilized pursuit? And that will take place, I'm trying to find it, on the 26th of August at 2 p.m. Hosted by George Sell again. So thank you again to all of you for joining us. And thank you for International Hospitality Media for hosting us. Again, a little plug for the Urban Living Festival. I will be there. I'm hoping to see a lot of you all there. Some of the sponsors and exhibitors already can be seen down there on the side. And here are some more sponsors. And if you would like to sponsor or join the festival in any way, there are tickets available, and you can contact Katie Houghton on those numbers and those details. The recording of the webinar is available, or will be available, I think, on YouTube, but you can also, I think if you've been signed up, you can get a recording sent to you as well. So again, thank you very much to everyone for their time and for the contributions. I look forward to seeing you again very soon, and have a wonderful August.
Bye, thank you.
Yeah. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.